Well, thank you very much for the introduction, Elenia, and for the opportunity to speak. Today we'll be talking about fragment hotspot, a method called fragment hotspot mapping, and how I've been using and further developing it in the course of my PhD, with the specifically with the idea to apply it to provide suggestions for the elaboration of crystallographic fragment screening hits. So in the past 2 decades, fragment-based drug design has shown to be a powerful tool for developing small molecule drugs and lead compounds. And screening fragments crystallographically can detect even very weakly binding fragments, but was historically unfeasible. However, now there are facilities such as XChem at Diamond Light Source, which have made the process much more routine, and they can process hundreds of fragment protein crystal structures routinely within a week. But progressing these hits to higher potency leads can take years and is very time and resource expensive. So the question is, how can computational methods help to accelerate the process of progressing these hits? So this type of experiment usually results in an ensemble of structures of the same protein in complex with different fragments. And the pros are that we can identify the hit, its binding mode, and the interactions it makes with the protein, but it can be difficult to rank the hits and decide which ones to elaborate and into what areas of the binding site. So to help with this problem, there is a need for methods that can streamline hit prioritization and elaboration and provide suggestions for compounds that are both potent and selective for the target, and then these can then be made into drugs or chemical probes, hopefully. So the first step involves choosing which fragments to elaborate and into what areas of the binding site. So with crystallographic screening, the focus is usually on fragments that make favorable binding site interactions and also that are tractable synthetically. The next steps involve using the most promising fragments as a basis to suggest and enumerate follow-up compounds, followed by an assessment or scoring of how likely these are to bind to the target protein. So docking is an often used way to do this, but traditionally used scoring functions are not usually parameterized for fragment-sized molecules, so computational methods that are specifically geared towards fragments are needed. So an analysis of the target fragment complexes can show what interactions in the binding site are being exploited and also give an idea of what further opportunities might be available around. But not all interactions within the binding site actually contribute equally to binding. And in fact, you have these hotspots, which are areas within the protein binding site pocket, which have a disproportionately large contribution to the binding affinity. And so from the point of view of choosing which fragments to elaborate and in what directions, it then makes sense to prioritize fragments and follow-ups that have a good overlap with the hotspot. And so the computational method I work with is called Fragment Hotspot Mapping, and was developed specifically with the goal of identifying these key hotspots and interactions. And it was originally developed by Chris Radu, who was a CCDC-sponsored PhD student back when this was published. So this method encodes information as binding site maps for apolar hydrogen bond donor and hydrogen bond acceptor interactions. And the highest scoring areas of the maps coincide with the sites and interactions that are exploited by fragment binding. So the method starts by taking a protonated ligand-free structure and running the CSD program Superstar on it. So Superstar uses the wealth of intermolecular interaction information stored in the CSD to generate propensity maps on the surface of the protein. And these indicate how likely a particular contact group is to be found on the surface of the protein. The contact groups themselves are these single atom probes, and for the Fragment Hotspot Maps method, we use 3 different ones. So there's an aromatic CH carbon probe, which is used to look for apolar interactions, and uncharged NH nitrogen is the hydrogen bond donor probe, and the carbonyl oxygen is the hydrogen bond acceptor. and these generate these kinds of propensity maps. So as you can see, the density in these maps is kind of spread over the surface of the protein, but we know that small molecules tend to bind in pockets. So to take that into account, the superstar maps are weighted using grids derived from a pocket detection method. And initially, Lixite was used, but the current version of the code actually uses a method called GECOM that uses image morphology operations to find pockets on the surface of the protein. So now we have these weighted atomic propensity maps, which you can see are kind of zeroing in on the binding pocket. But they do not yet consider the molecular context of fragment binding. So to take that into account, these weighted maps are then further sampled with 3 fragment-like probes corresponding to this, again, to the 3 interaction types. So the probes are translated to the highest scoring points in the weighted maps, and then rotated around the kind of the head atom. And each of these rotating poses is scored. So to score them, each atom is assigned a score from the nearest point in the corresponding map. So for example, even though this is a hydrogen bond acceptor probe, all of the atoms in the in kind of the ring section will have scores taken from the apolar map. So this kind of mimics a fragment trying to put an acceptor group in a position. So poses are scored by taking the geometric mean of all the individual atom scores. And this is done basically to disregard poses that clash with the protein, since those automatically get a score of 0. And then the highest score observed at each point is kept. And this results in the fragment hotspot maps. So as you can see, these maps still have density through in large areas over the protein structure, but they have a much greater range of scores. And in fact, if you contour around the highest to the highest ranges, that will actually highlight the areas and interactions that have been shown to drive fragment binding. So in this case, it's a kinase, and it highlights the hinge found before. So the fragment hotspot mapping method is available as a Python package, which the code itself for that is freely available, but it's based on the CSD Python API, which does and also on Superstar. So they do require a Discovery, I think, or enterprise license. Yeah, basically you can. There are tutorials on the repos which allow you to calculate and visualize the hotspot maps. This is the one that has the latest code. This one has kind of more.
Social meeting.
Can everyone unmute themselves, please? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. So yeah, and in addition to calculating and visualizing the hotspot maps, there are also a couple of further functionality that Chris, Pete Curran, who's also a PhD student, and myself have been working on, including combining hotspot maps, which I will talk about now, and comparing them as well. So now that we looked at how a single fragment hotspot map is calculated, we set out to determine how the information from multiple hotspot maps calculated for the same target can be summarized. And then we also wanted a way to look at differences between ensembles of closely related proteins. And the workflow for this involves first aligning and preparing the proteins, then calculating hotspot maps for each of these structures. These hotspot maps are combined by taking the median at each point with some caveats that we'll talk about briefly, and then 2 ensemble maps for closely related proteins can then be compared to generate a selectivity map after some post-processing. And yeah, just again to reiterate, there are 3 types of fragment hotspot maps which reflect the different the types of interactions that most often found to contribute to fragment binding. And the polar features So in the donor and acceptor maps, a localized and directional, hence the more focused blobs that you see, and then apolar interactions are more dispersed and tend to take up a larger area in the maps. So how do we compile the ensemble maps? The hotspot map for each probe type is a 3-dimensional grid with a spacing of half an angstrom. So when we combine information from an ensemble of aligned hotspot maps, what we get at each point in space is a distribution of the hotspot scores assigned to that point across all of the maps. And in some cases, many of these values could be zeros, and this reflects local movement in the binding site. And it's found much more often in the maps for the polar features, which are more sensitive to motion. And so initially we investigated 2 ways of combining the hotspot maps, taking the maximum value sampled in the distribution or taking its median, considering the zeros. And what we found is that both of these had their shortcomings. So in the case of the maximum maps, these don't take the frequency of a feature into account, and so they have the danger of overestimating the importance of features that may only transiently be present, but are otherwise low scoring. And so this then increases the number of false positives that you get downstream in the analysis. And then the median maps had the converse problem where they can actually underestimate the importance of features. For example, in this case, they missed the hinge acceptor pharmacophore in a kinase structure, which again was worrying. So we needed a way to combine the maps that didn't introduce false positives downstream, yet was sufficiently sensitive to the polar features, as well as containing information from the ensemble. It came up with this notion of frequency. So the frequency of a point in the ensemble is the fraction of cases where a non-zero hotspot score is assigned to that point. And basically we can filter out points with values that are only very rarely observed in this way. And this gave, in the end, a good compromise between the information we get from polar features and the information about their frequency. And for the apolar maps, as they're less sensitive to the local movements, this is generally less of an issue. So now that we had a way to compile information across an ensemble, we moved on to the question of comparing ensembles of structures of closely related proteins. So this is the workflow used to calculate the selectivity maps. For each probe type, a difference map is generated by subtracting the ensemble map from the off-target from that of the on-target. And then at the next step, the map can be filtered to only the highest scoring points above a certain percentile. And we found this to be particularly important for the apolar maps, as they contain a much greater number of low scoring points. Features are then detected in the maps using the HTB scan algorithm, and the different numbers of minimum points per cluster reflect the differences in the sizes of the features. So that's as the apolar features tend to be much larger and more dispersed. And then clusters are then scored by taking the median hotspot score value of all the points in the cluster. And there is also a condition that selective features need to be a minimal distance away from features of the same probe type that confer off-target selectivity. So those can't be physically in the same space. And then to validate the method, we compiled retrospective examples of cases where a fragment or ligand has been elaborated with the goal of gaining selectivity over a closely related off-target. And then to simulate a fragment screening scenario, only structures with bound ligands smaller than 300 Daltons that are not crystallization additives were used. And then the selectivity maps, we saw that the selectivity maps could detect and prioritize binding site features that have been used to drive the development of selective compounds. So one such example is this compound, which is a precursor to the bromodomain probe BA299. And it shows selectivity for the bromodomain BRD1 over the closely related BRPF1. So the compound makes a hydrogen bond with the backbone of serine 592 in BRD1, And that's an interaction that's not available in the off-target, as the corresponding residue is a proline. And the selectivity maps are able to pick this up and highlight it. So this is the acceptor feature there. And then this next example shows how the hotspot maps can detect a selective hydrophobic pocket that opens up in the kinase p38 alpha, but it's not present in the closely related ERK2 kinase. And this is caused by the bulkier gatekeeper residue in ERK2, which blocks access. And this is used by this compound SB1, which is a p38 alpha selective inhibitor that uses this interaction. And yeah, so yeah, and so this work on those ensemble and selectivity maps is currently being written up, and there is a publication in progress. So based on the retrospective validation, what are some recommendations on using the ensemble and hotspot selectivity maps on an unknown target in the context of a live campaign? So for the ensemble maps, it's good to remember that they're a way to summarize information and to generate hypotheses based on it. So they're very sensitive to the quality of the underlying data. And it's helpful when compiling an ensemble to also have some idea of how diverse that ensemble is, and then this can also inform your confidence in how much we trust the features that we observe coming in from that ensemble. In terms of size and frequency and method parameters for large ensembles, which in these cases we consider things with above 20 structures, a frequency threshold of 20% we found will identify the most persistent features. And the ensemble maps can also be used on smaller ensembles, which in this case would be something like 5 to 10 structures, with the caveat that these features that are observed in those maps would be more dependent on the individual conformations. And so in those cases, it's particularly important to also verify these hypotheses by either doing experiments or running complementary computational methods to assess how much that interaction would contribute to the binding of a ligand. And then in terms of the selectivity maps, an ideal selective feature would be one that both scores highly in the maps and is located far away from features that ground propensity for the off-target. So what does far away enough mean? In the Broma domain examples, we found that kind of putting that parameter to an angstrom and a half could still identify all the selective features. But in the case of kinases, which tend to have more flexible binding sites, we went up to 3 angstroms. So the recommendation for a novel target would be to start at the high end with 3 angstroms to identify really the most prominent features, and then if further hypotheses are needed, we can move to smaller distances or lower cluster cutoff scores, and then of course verify these experimentally or through other methods as well. So in terms of next steps for this project, as mentioned, we're working on writing up the ensemble and selectivity maps. I have also been looking into using complementary computational methods to rank and characterize hotspot features with regards to elaborating ligands. So I've been looking into using this steered MD method, dynamic undocking, which basically provides an estimate of the structural stability, looks at the structural stability of a fragment protein complex by estimating the work needed to break a key hydrogen bond contact between the fragment and the protein. And then I have recently also started looking into using snapshots from MD trajectories in cases where, for example, a few crystal structures are available, and characterizing how these hotspots behave. And also, this has been more difficult in the past year with COVID, but collaborating with medicinal chemists on live projects to get experimental validation for the method predictions. So yeah, I would like to thank my supervisors, Brian, Frank, Jason, and Anthony, Chris, and Pete for developing the method and doing some fantastic work on the API, and everyone else who's helped in the project. And thank you for listening.